good evening to everyone. It's great to see so many people out here. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm really excited. We're seeing some of the same names back tonight, but also some new names. Seems that this is a topic of interest to many, many people, which I thought it would be. So just a couple of quick things before we get started. Just remember to mute yourself. There are a number of us here tonight. So unless the presenters are okay with you jumping in with questions partway through, you can also just put them in the chat and we'll cover them at the end. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Catherine Dale. I'm the coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And with us tonight as well is Jenna McDermott, who's the assistant coordinator, and she and I will be keeping an eye on the chat and moderating things. For those of you who haven't heard this spiel before, Jenna and I both work for Birds Canada, which is a national charitable organization whose mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. Sounds really good, but how do we do that on the ground? Well, the answer is usually we do it through citizen science programs. So citizen scientists are people just like you who are out in the field seeing birds and contribute that data to our online data set. And each year, more than 70,000 citizen science volunteers volunteer in Birds Canada programs nationwide. We're a relatively new organization here in Newfoundland. We arrived in 2019, and we currently run two programs here in Newfoundland. The first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. Many of you have probably heard me talk about this before, so I won't go through it in detail, but essentially this is a 5-year citizen science project to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. And the other program that we run here is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. That is a slightly less intensive program. It's a 6-week survey we run each year from the April 1st to May the 15th. And it involves volunteers picking up a predetermined route and going out just one night in that 6 weeks to survey that route for owls. We're always looking for volunteers for both of these programs, and anybody can contribute to any of them. A lot of people are a bit intimidated by the Breeding Bird Atlas because they think they need to know a lot about birds, but this is not the case, because even if the only thing you recognize is a robin, but you see it building a nest in your front yard, that's information that you can contribute to the Atlas. The owl survey is also extremely beginner friendly. We don't actually have that many nocturnal owls here in Newfoundland, and so it's actually pretty easy to learn the sounds that you need to know. So if you're interested in volunteering for either of these programs, you can contact us at nlatlas@birdscanada.org. And finally, just before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our sponsors and funders. It's because of them that we're able to put on this great webinar series where we get to learn a lot about the research that some of our scientists are doing on Newfoundland's birds. And that segues quite nicely into our introduction to tonight's speakers. So I'm really excited to introduce them because we're getting a 2 for the price of 1 deal tonight. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Andrew Lang, who's the head of the Munn Biology Department and a virus expert, and his lab has been studying avian influenza in wild birds. And we're going to hear from Dr. Bill Montevecchi, who's a professor of psychology, biology, and ocean sciences at Munn and one of the province's top seabirds. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you guys. Go take it away, Bill and Andrew. And I will stop sharing, and you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Okay, Andrew, I'll just give it just a bit of context. Let me do a screen share here. I think this is it. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint.
Do you see that? Do you see it, Andrew?
Yeah, now it's full screen, so it's good. Okay,
well, Catherine contacted me about giving a talk, and clearly there were lots of, there's a lot of people here that are bird experts and just have interest in birds, and clearly there were lots of topics we could address, and but I suggested that maybe we could focus on this avian influenza because it's so dominant. So many people have experienced it, and so many people have contributed to the information that we have and can continue to do that. So I mean, you know, we'll just do this as we go, but there's just many people and groups involved, and as we go, you'll see that. I just want to say this is really a big issue. It's a pan-Atlantic issue. There have been major die-offs at gannet, MERS, puffins in Europe, Norway, Iceland, and here in our province, and in Quebec in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there's a lot of big questions about population effects and what that means and where this virus is and what it's going to do. Is it going to stick around? So, but anyway, tonight, you know, we'll talk through this, and Andrew's really an expert, so I'm going to hand it over to him in a second here. But we have a local focus, but Andrew's going to start off with our first question. You know, we have 3 questions: where it came from, what it's doing, and what could be coming next in 2023. So I'm going to just hand it over to Andrew to take that first question, because he and Greg Robertson from Environment Canada were part of a huge collaboration to figure out, one, how it got here. And so Andrew can take that. And then otherwise, I would say the 3 things that we addressed tonight is the assessment of the mortality, and only at a species level, not at a population level. And right from the get-go, it seemed pretty apparent there was a east to west radiation in the influenza as it spread from Quebec to Newfoundland. And so we'll look at that and look at changing species effects as the influenza progressed from east to west, and some unexpected occurrences that you know, arose as well, and then maybe some speculation about what's next. So there's a lot, and I would really suggest people, you know, almost feel free. I'm fine having this as a discussion. I mean, we have a presentation to make, but if you have a burning question, I think you can just pop in with it. But otherwise, if you want to hold it or chat it, either way. And so I'm going to call on Andrew, and you can see this is the paper. This is the most recent paper on the avian flu and its incursion into Newfoundland. So I think Andrew can, and what all I did there, Andrew might want to do it differently. I just took the abstract and I highlighted some things, but Andrew, however you want to do it, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Well, and thanks, Bill, for inviting me to come on and do this with you. So it's my pleasure to be here. So I played a minor role in this work where we were trying to figure out, and this involved people in Canada at various government agencies, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as people in different countries in Europe, the UK. And basically what happened, if for just to recap the history, is the first realization that this virus had arrived here was because of birds dying at a local display farm, I guess is maybe the best term for it. And then retrospectively, it was realized that a wild bird, a gull, was actually infected and died before that. So so the farm outbreak was early December, but the gull was from late November. And so the group of us got together to try and figure out how the virus might have got here, because what became clear from the sequencing of the virus that was done in Winnipeg by CFIA, and then the analyses that were done in the UK with those sequences, is that the virus here in November and December was most closely related to viruses in Europe in the spring of 2021. And so somehow between spring of 2021 and late fall of 2021, the virus seems to have made it here from Europe. And so we then tried to figure out the possible routes, or that it could have come. And so I think maybe the subsequent slide is
Andrew, I just put in that note at the very bottom because I found it so interesting that your paper, it's almost curious. Your paper was accepted on the 16th of May, and that's just when it started to happen. You know, it started to happen in May. So it's interesting because you have the most recent science paper, but at that time, you know, there was no large scale mortality. So
no, it was
I mean,
really
it's
limited
very,
number of birds, and but then it really took off from there. And I have to say, personally, I was extremely surprised how fast the virus went across the continent. So it showed up in the Maritimes and then coastal Atlantic US. And then, you know, it seemed faster than should have happened at that time of year. Basically, winter steamrolled right across North America. And yeah, so that was maybe surprising.
so that was just a summary that I made, Andrew, but I think you've covered all of that. The next one's
Okay.
the maps that you guys generated, which you probably the best one to go to.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, well, no, so, yeah, sorry, you can go back to that just for a second, Bill. Maybe.
Oh, what? I'm sorry.
You can go back to the previous one just for a second.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
So one of the things that we immediately were discussing after looking at the virus was the bird reports that in the fall there were these arrivals here in Newfoundland of these Eurasian species. And there was a big storm in the fall, I know, that brought some of these birds here. And I had talked to Ian Jones about this as well. And so these barnacle geese and pink-footed geese. And so that was one of our theories, is that there was just a infected sort of storm vagrant that showed up. And we can't rule that out. But now if you go to the next slide, Bill. You can go to the next slide now, Bill, sorry.
Okay.
So then we looked at different, I guess we came up with two different scenarios for how the virus might have shown up, because we know it was in the spring in Europe in the spring, and a lot of those birds in the spring in Europe would have migrated to Arctic and subarctic breeding locations. So Iceland, Greenland, even Arctic Canada in some cases. And then there they may have transferred the virus over to birds that subsequently migrated in the fall down through the, I guess, Western Atlantic to places like Newfoundland. And so that's, I guess, the scenario on the left, is that these infected birds in the spring of 2021 migrated north, interacted with birds originating from North America, and then transmitted the virus, and then they flew south and brought it to St. John's. And whether those were vagrants or just off-course migrants, it's not really clear. And then on the right, there's this other issue that in the fall, a lot of these northern breeding birds, seabirds in particular, things like murres and puffins, they just head out into the middle of the North Atlantic, and that's where they spend the late fall through the winter. And so we thought there was also the possibility that the transmission happened there, and then somehow from that population ended up into Newfoundland. So we still don't know, because we don't have any data to support or refute one hypothesis or the other. We just know where it was in the spring and then where it ended up in the fall. And I think there's a bunch of ways that could have happened. So, but yeah, there were no, and in the middle of the ocean, it's hard to capture mass mortality events. So if those were happening, no one would know. And that's a big problem in general with this outbreak in seabirds globally, is at Cape St. Mary's, we can capture it and see what's happening, and in coastal communities where people see dead birds. But the vast majority of seabirds breed in locations where no one can go, or no one goes very often. And so the reality is we're probably missing most of the mortality that's happening. And so it might really be next year that we see the effects on those populations. So, thanks. Is that it for me? I think that's it for my part.
Well, just kibitz every however you want. I mean, this is what we know about the primary victims. Gannets, murre, puffin, and kittiwake. So those seem to be the primary victims, and we'll take a look at them a bit. Andrew, and whenever you want.
It's not just limited to Europe and Canada. This is definitely in. So there's been big deaths of not necessarily seabirds, but in other parts of the world as well. And so I think the scope is yet to be really realized.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think this is local knowledge of what was happening here. And just to unroll it, I mean, it's kind of exciting. We knew in June and in May, we knew that virus was on the west coast of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And in early July, fishermen noticed dead gannets on the water and actually told the interpreters at Cape St. Mary's and told me that they saw dead gannets on the water. They collected some. And then I think I just had one immature of the 4 that they had. I passed it on to Sabina at CWS, and that immature bird tested. I think 2 of the birds tested positive, the 2 that we had, but one was an immature, and that's of interest to us. And I'll explain that in a minute. But then our fear was, well, the fuse is really lit. So that was in. I think that was actually at the end of May, because in early July, we went on Canada Day, we collected samples from birds. We collected these for Environment Canada. We collected blood samples, and we collected swabs that went to Andrew's lab. Same kind of thing that you would do if you were testing yourself or somebody else for COVID. We tested birds here. We can't get to the stack. We tested birds here, and we tested birds over here. And we tested 15 breeding adults, and Andrew showed that they were all negative. So there were no positive occurrences. 2 weeks later, we went to Point Lance, which is a beach just to the east over this way. And we got a whole bunch of birds, including birds that, like fulmar, but we got gannets, murres, and they all tested positive. So it looked like, yeah, we didn't see it here at the beginning of July, and then 2 weeks later, off like Andrew just mentioned, off colony, we're getting these dead birds. So it seems like, yeah, the fuse is lit, and let's just watch what happens. And we also have this interest in immature gannets, because there really is a notion that these I mean, we know, from watching gannets, these are the birds that move among colonies. So once a breeding adult gets to the colony, it can forage for, a couple hundred kilometers around that colony. But the immatures, particularly the subadults, they're moving from colony to colony. And so when we got that positive test from that one at Cape St. Mary's, and then Robert Blackmore-Torrey and collected another subadult, and that was in Holyrood, just about the same time. And again, passed the bird on to Sabina at CWS, and it too tested positive. So, we have this running sort of speculation, and the guys in Europe, I know the guys in Europe that are studying gannets, and they've been running with this for a while for the same reason, that these birds could be the vectors because of their movement from colony to colony. So the interesting thing was, and Andrew might be able to speak to some of these latencies, but so that was early July, or late, and actually it was late June. That's when it was. It was late June, but we didn't see the real impact at the colony. It took a while. It took a while. It came in July, so it really took a while. And through most of June and July, it looked like this, even though we had some birds that tested negative off, off the colony and nearby. But then, this is where it kind of ended up by, in August. That's when it really, for some reason, it really took off in August. And this is part of that stack at Cape St. Mary's. And you can just see lots of dead adults here, lots of spaces. I'm sure there's a few dead chicks in here somewhere. And yeah, there's one, but there's a couple of survivors in this, but we're really fortunate. A student doing an honors in my lab this year, Noah Kareen, he lives in Point Lance, so he covered the beach surveys for us, and he kept track of breeding success. And just to tell you, I mean, about what that effect might be, we have recorded, since the 1970s, the lowest breeding success that we've ever had at Cape St. Mary's, and that includes 2012, when we had a heat wave when all these gannets abandoned. So this year we had hot water and we had the pandemic, and breeding success is coming in. These numbers are jumping around and we have to look at them, but it's going to be 20% or less, which is about as low as it can get. And I think our lowest before this was about 40% or 39%. And this year the breeding success is about 20 at Cape St. Mary's. So, and lots of dead murres around the coast. And this is the this is the spreading hypothesis that we east to west hypothesis that we're looking at. And there's a student in my lab as well, Gretchen McPhail. There's a lot of us contributing to this, and supporting her honors thesis to look at the radiation across the province. And this, it's really interesting to know that the information we glean, that's why I think it's important to have this talk with everybody tonight, because the information we gleaned really came from social media. And we made lots of pleas on the radio if you saw birds to report them. And I would just say it's not too late to do that now. I mean, I just got a report, I'm sure 2 days ago, of, I'm trying to think, it was on the Northern Peninsula, of dead sick gannet. Yeah, so I mean, if anybody still sees birds, great, we want to hear about it. But as well, if you were out birding this summer and you have some records or some rough dates where and what you saw, yeah, we can still use it for sure. So, and here it came, and these reports, these initial reports were coming from fishermen and, fishermen on the water, fishermen in Placentia Bay. And we're getting reports of lots of birds in the Burin in June. And then, our fear was, again, with this immature gannet moving around, our fear was, oh, it's gonna, we just talked about this for weeks. I think it's coming. I hope it doesn't. Maybe it'll miss, and we, Chris Mooney and I, we kept having those conversations, but it came in and we started seeing a few dead birds, but it took a while to ramp up, and then it just got devastating. But it kept going, and, by late July, it was in Witless Bay. And moving on, well, in Witless Bay, it was different. I mean, just encapsulation. Most of the birds reported there's no gannets there. Most of the birds reported were kittiwakes and puffins, and it didn't seem to be a devastation, like it was at Cape St. Mary's. But in fact, there were a lot of birds killed, and again, we don't know what the outcome is of that for population effect that means. But I mean, I saw dead kittiwakes on the ledges on Gull Island, and so there were numbers of reports, and then bay bulls and other places, and there were reports coming in. So that's what it looked like happened in Witless Bay. And then, in early August, it moved again, and it moved, past Baccalieu, which is a gannet colony. There are 3 gannet colonies in Newfoundland: Cape St. Mary's, Baccalieu, and Funk. There's 3 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Magdalens, one on Anticosti Island up here, and a very large one back here in Bonaventure Island. But there are only 6 in North America. But this was really a terrifying event. We started getting dead birds, Cape Friels, Strait Shore, Bonavista Vista Bay, Fogo. And why that's so terrifying is because this is what the Murre colony on Funk Island looks like. And, that's the densest, largest colony of that species in the world. And it's about 80% of the population of common murres, in the Northwest Atlantic. So to just think about, a virus getting into a situation like that was overwhelming. So fortunately, Canadian Wildlife Service, Steve Duffy, Chris Ward, Sabina Wilhelm, they flew over in July. And so just to give you a little, this is the gannet colony. This is incredibly high resolution photography. And I was just looking at it with Chris this morning, and you can blow this up, and you can actually, and even on this level, the sub-dead gannets around the periphery, these kind of places. And I think Sabina said she counted 17. This is on July 15th. And anyways, birds around the periphery were of interest, but particularly of interest, when subadults come into this colony, that's where they nest. They nest on the periphery. So, whether or not those were subadults, I think that's something would be really key to understand. Chris thinks he might be able to have enough resolution to tell if some of those dead ones are not, pure white breeding adults. And the other thing is, this is the murres. They ring, they outline the gannet colony. So this is the murres, and that was 15 July. But here's the shot they took in September. This is 17 September, 15 September. I think the other one was 17 July. But so this should be white. This is the gannet colony. This should be white, just like the previous one. The gannets don't leave, some of them will leave, but on Funk, they don't leave till late September. So this should be just like the other one. It should be white. It's not, it's brown. And, when you blow that up, there's lots of dead birds. And like Andrew said, we got so many dead gannets along the coast that, well, maybe all these spaces are just dead gannets, and they're, they died inshore, they died at sea. But you can see absolutely massive effect. This is thousands. This is many thousands of birds, as is the case at Cape St. Mary's. And interestingly, and bafflingly, to me anyway, Chris looked at these photos and cannot, and I think he has the resolution to do it, cannot see. So these are the unexpected things that really make scratch your head. Cannot see any dead murres. So there'll be another look for that. He's looked, but so that's just, again, just one of the paradoxes of what happened. And I think the last thing, before we move on to something else, I think the last thing I just want to point out, this, because this is going to be part of Gretchen's honors thesis, is that as this virus moved, there were different species impacts, at least in terms of what showed up on the beaches. So here, murres, it was mostly murres. I mean, where did those murres come from? And there were gannets. Well, they obviously would be from Cape St. Mary's, and presumably some of those murres were as well. And there were razorbills. And then, but and probably in this order of ranking, when it was on the Burin Peninsula, and again, this is fishermen reporting. And then when it got to Cape St. Mary's, clearly gannets took the dominant hit, but there were lots of dead murres. We moved into Witless Bay, and we did get gannets on the East Coast, and we know from some tracking that Kyle D'Entremont has done that gannets from Cape St. Mary's will sometimes get up in these areas to forage. So there were dead gannets on the East Coast, but again, the dominant species were kittiwakes and puffins. There were some murres, but it's mostly kittiwakes and puffins. And then funk, when mostly what we've gleaned, on the beaches have been gannets and murres. So, it's curious. Maybe, I don't know, maybe those murres got off lightly, but there certainly were lots of dead murres around. And we don't have much information here. And I think we still could potentially get some. Like I said, I just had a report of sick gannet Northern Peninsula, and the gannets will all be essentially off colony now, but they're still some of them will still be in the area, and some stragglers will be around. So it's possible we'll get some more information from up here or anywhere. Yeah, and I just wanted to say that it's not too late for earlier reports. And if we did, there is this sort of contagion hypothesis. I don't even know if that's a right way to say it, but you might expect nesting density to be related to mortality if in fact it was really a contagion of the virus being, highly contagious neighbor to neighbor. And, it is consistent. I mean, I think and this could change, but I think when it all gets added up, we're going to see more dead murres than anything. And they do have the highest nesting density. Now you can say, well, there's more murres than gannets, but that doesn't, so that doesn't mean that it's necessarily more serious because there's more dead birds, but there is a consistency with nest density, and then these two species nest in densities that would be, less dense than gannets, and they're on the lower end of what we got for bodies showing up, and so that, anyway, something to explore. That's I just want to put it out like that, but it might be something that comes out when people do finer analyses of the situation. And the unexpected, yike. I don't know if can you guys read the captions at the top of the slide? Mine are buried behind. Andrew,
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, good. So it doesn't matter. I can't, but so this was, and Andrew might want to talk to this because Andrew and I discussed this a little bit. I mean, if I was going to make one, prediction, well, we're going to have heaps of gulls. These gulls just ate the sick murres and the sick gannets. They scavenged, and they were there all the time. And so many of the carcasses we got, no pectoral, no inner organs and stuff like that, but we didn't. I mean, there were dead herring gulls, but nothing, and nothing like I would have expected, and that was true as well with eagles, because we did have a couple of eagles that, right in the same place where we were getting dead murres right at the same time, but it never turned into anything of any significance. And again, that just a curiosity. We know the eagles were taking the sick murres and some of the gannets. So I don't know, Andrew, did you want to say anything about why? I mean, I don't know why they might be okay, or.
It's hard to speak to eagles because I think no one really has a good understanding of eagles and their susceptibility to influenza, but eagles definitely got infected around North America and Europe. Eagles have been highly affected by scavenging. So I think and we did have gulls die, right? So I think and the most likely scenario was they got it by scavenging, and our first wild bird here in Newfoundland was a gull. So I think they were getting it and they were dying from it. And I don't know in terms of recovery of bodies if for some reason it's lower, or there is the possibility that they are have some immunity from previous infections. So if you go and sample gulls and test their blood, many of them you will find have previously been infected by influenza viruses, not necessarily this H5, but there will certainly be some immunity in previously infected birds, and whether that protects them from every strain or not is very complicated, and I don't think anyone really knows.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. So, but it did, yeah, and they must be obviously tough birds with that kind of life history of scavenging. But yeah, there was, anyway, we the numbers we have are not very significant, and so many, and not only not finding dead ones. I mean, just lots of people just call and say, "Oh, the eagles are doing great." Although there were some people that were completely, confused, like, "I don't think the eagles are nesting here this year." But there was nothing. At least we didn't get the signal. It doesn't. We didn't get it anyway. So I don't know, Andrew. Maybe you want to talk about this. These are just some notes on, what might happen next. Like it's not going away, and some of these are just, extractions from your paper, and so in Nature there, yeah.
Right. So at one point early on, I had this fantasy that maybe it would never make the mainland and it would be go away completely, but that is obviously not what happened. And so I guess based on what's happened in Eurasia, it hasn't gone away there. So why would it go away here? I guess would be my only insight. And there is the possibility that it could increase the risk. I don't think you can increase the risk to poultry. It's already as risky as it could possibly be. I think the risk to birds is just continued circulation. Risk to humans, right now, I think the risk to humans remains extremely low, zero, essentially. If this virus was a risk to humans, we would know it. The current virus, anyways. I know of 2 human infections by this particular virus, one in Europe where an elderly man was living with 30 or so ducks in his house and they were infected. And he still, even though it was elderly, had basically asymptomatic infection. And then there was one poultry farm worker who got infected on an infected premises. So I still maintain that right now, anyways, the risk to humans is essentially zero. That doesn't mean it couldn't change, because this virus, its whole secret is that it changes very fast. So that could happen in the future. But this is really a wild bird adapted virus. And unlike the previous versions that you mentioned, like from 2005, that one was not wild bird adapted. It caused these outbreaks that burned out like a match and was gone. But this one has maintained circulation in wild bird populations. And so it doesn't kill as many birds as those previous versions. And that's why it's been able to continue to circulate. And so lots of species, especially a lot of ducks, they get infected, but they don't necessarily die. Some do, but many don't. And so it continues to be transmitted and circulated. So I think 2023 breeding colony assessments, the point you have there is going to be huge. What's on these colonies next year, that's going to tell us a lot about what actually happened this year, because I feel like right now we don't really know. Chicken farms, I mean, they're pretty, I'm not an industry expert. My understanding is they're already quite regulated and they do have biosecurity measures. It still manages to get in. That's the amazing thing, right? You have these biosecurity measures, but still these farms get infected. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and the merhunt thing I find really interesting. And there's, I know Wayne Humphreys is on. He's been studying the merhunt. I think there's a reduced incidence of hunters going out. And I've talked to a lot of hunters, and most of them say they wouldn't eat a tur, and which is, I find, probably shrewd. And also it's clearly, if you're not going to eat the bird, then don't shoot it. And but there's some people that are going to eat the bird. Some people are, but I think there might be fewer hunters going out. I haven't talked to a hunter who said he would eat a bird. That doesn't mean there. And I know there are hunters out there, because I just asked one hunter, I think he was from Twillingate, if he was going to eat the birds he shot, and he said no, but I gave him to my buddy who will eat anything. And so there's probably going to be people out there that will eat them. And I should say, I think it's not connected to this, but we just get lots of questions as well. I just had a hunter, Gerald King from Twillingate. He told me all the turs that he collected, and he's been hunting for a long time. He told me all the turs he collected had black livers, and he didn't think it was blood or anything he had done in cleaning the bird. And I have no idea what that means, but I find that, most of the hunters I know, and it's just the ones I know, but most of these guys are pretty much gourmet cooks, and they really want those birds, and they really want good birds. So, I mean, it might really temper it. I don't know. It remains to be seen. It's, in a way, it's kind of curious that Environment Canada, or whoever does that, would even open the murre hunt. And there's been so many hunters who've even questioned that. Why is it open? I think that's a good question. But anyway, I don't know, unless Andrew's got any more, we could take questions. I mean, and the other thing is, you can get overwhelmingly depressed and talking about these things. And, there's going to be survivors, and they're going to be tough birds. And like Andrew's reminded me, it's like with COVID, and I mean, Andrew's already said this, but there's birds out there that might be carrying it and are fine. And there are going to be lots of survivors. So, but it remains to be seen, how many have not survived, in that whole process. So it's ongoing, and I don't think it's going to go away. And I think we're probably all going to be looking at it, next year at least, and see what happens. So unless, Andrew, you got any other things,
Well, I just had
okay.
one comment about the eating birds and the risk. So
Yeah.
if something's cooked, this virus will not survive. So there's no risk from consuming it unless you're eating your murre raw, which I don't think is the choice.
Good to know.
But during the handling,
I'm not going to tell that to any hunters.
But during the risk would be during the handling. But frankly, Bill, if this virus was a risk, you would have it, and you've interacted with as many dead birds as anyone. So frankly,
so not a worry. Yeah.
Well, that's my opinion, and that's based on the current situation. I think if it was different, we would know it. But like I said, that doesn't mean it won't change in subsequent years. So.
So Catherine, yeah, there you are.
There, yeah, I'm here. Thank you both very much. That was super interesting, and there are many, many questions in the chat. So I'm just going to start at the top and keep going from there. And if anybody has a question and they want to jump in, feel free to unmute yourself or put your hand up, and I can stop going through the chat questions. Or you can just keep adding to the chat and I'll get there. So Carolyn said that she found many birds affected while she was kayaking on the East Coast. And she was wondering if there's anything that kayakers and boaters can do to be helpful with the avian flu situation.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's what happens when we're engaged in a crisis where we have minimal options. We can't go out and give these birds, injections or anything like that. So there don't seem to be options like that. We just have to watch it run its course. But I think from my perspective, and Andrew might have others and other people might have others, from my perspective, a very powerful thing to do is to provide information. And that's why we spent so much time with the media, and we went out there. And right now we're going to, use that information to try and figure out what actually happened. We didn't have 1,000 biologists out there, and kayakers. Yeah, I just see Carolyn's talking about. I mean, we had so many reports from kayakers, but just from people walking on the beaches, and they reported because they were worried. Can we have picnics? Can we bring our kids here? Do we have to worry about the dogs getting them? So people were reporting, and we like a dog with a bone, we stayed on social media and we encouraged it, and we followed up with questions if somebody said something about what they saw and we could get more information. We went for it. And that's what people can do. And that's what people can do right now. If you see birds, absolutely report them. There's I think a government number where in the past they were coming to pick up the birds, and they did this a lot of times, but sometimes there were so many birds they couldn't keep up with it. So there are ways to do that. We were interested because we swabbed a whole bunch of birds on the Northeast coast, Cape St. Mary's, East Coast, and we're still doing that when we find birds, and we send all those to Andrew, and that's really, really interesting and really telling. And so if people see birds, we sometimes we can access them as well. But I think that's what people can do. I don't know if Andrew has any other suggestions, or anybody has any other
Well,
suggestions.
I would just say reporting that is really important, because there are people that are trying to tally, the actual effects of this, which is extremely difficult. And then based on something you said there, Bill, I just want to say, like, dogs, I would say people would want to be very careful, because actually foxes have been infected, and presumably by consuming dead infected birds. So some mammals have been infected, and as far as I know, it's only been foxes. But so I wouldn't want my dog anywhere near a dead bird.
Yeah, people asked about dogs all the time, and I thought there was I thought there wasn't a transmission to mammals, but there have been some.
Foxes, yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay, so that's great. And since you mentioned reporting, I should add that there are some reports in the chat. People are adding a couple of places they've seen dead birds. So Bill and Andrew, I'll send you a record of the chat.
Oh, that would be
when we're
great.
done, so that you can follow up with anybody if you need to, and you'll have a record of where people are seeing things. Wayne Humphreys asked about shearwaters. He was getting about 10% shearwaters where in areas where he came across dead birds, especially in the northern portion of Trinity Bay. 10% shearwaters, 10% gannet, and the rest mostly common murres. So do you know anything about what's going on with shearwaters?
We've got some that have tested positive, and they're always a major concern. Because as people know, they're trans-equatorial migrants. So those shearwaters are just here in the summer on their winter vacation, and they're heading back, to breeding islands off of South Africa, off of South America. So yeah, Andrew just did this model of it moving across the Atlantic. So my understanding is that H5N1 isn't in the southern hemisphere, and Andrew can correct that. But what I saw, I didn't think it was. But anyway, here's one way to get it down there. If we had fulmar and shearwater with infections with these were ones that Andrew analyzed, but whenever that happens, yeah, there's this concern that that's going to move those birds. If there are birds out there that are infected, they're going south, and they're going into the southern, Southern Ocean, Southern Atlantic.
It's definitely in the south. It's in Africa, for example.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
well,
And in terms of other places, it might be, Ian wanted to know if there's any evidence of birds, for example, MERS, dying at Canadian Arctic colonies in August.
I don't know of any, because I saw somebody else asked a question about thick-billed MERS, and that would, because that's basically the bird that gets hunted in the tur hunt. And yeah, and I don't know of any. I was trying to get to Funk Island because there are thick-billed MERS there. So I don't know of any. I would just have to say I don't know. But it would be a question for Environment Canada. I mean, I think they would know. I don't know of anything north of southern Labrador from information that we have.
Yeah.
And unless
Me as
Andrew,
well.
yeah.
No, same. That's my same information, is that the Labrador thick-billed mer colonies were not affected, as far as I know.
I shouldn't do this, but I'm just going to interject my own question here because as somebody who runs a citizen science project and is very aware that in order for information to come in, you need people. Is there any chance that this is happening and we just don't know because there aren't as many people to see it?
That's absolutely right. We're just writing a paper, Tori Burt and Sydney Collins and myself in my lab. We're just writing a paper on social, what we can use from social media to look at the incidence of of an event, and can we get some dimensions on the space and the timing of that event. And what we have to admit is that you're absolutely right when you say most reports come in from St. John's, because most of the people are there and most of the eyes are there. And so there's definitely a correlation as population goes down, sightings go down. What puts a bump in that kind of distribution is that sometimes there are just really, really keen observers, in some of the outports, and you get a few people like that, you really start getting good information from coastal communities. But there's tremendous weakness in this kind of data. But what we think is possible is that even with this very weak kind of qualitative data, if you get enough of it and you filter it enough and you put restrictions on things, you think, oh, that's just impossible. And you come up with a rule base for restricting the information that you use, you can probably differentiate some signal from noise and be able to say, yeah, this was here are the hot spots, something like that. And this is the duration of the event, and this is the onset, this is the offset. So yes, but Catherine, just to answer your question directly, that's what happened. So that's an overwhelming weakness of that kind of data. It's confounded with population level. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. But, again, as somebody who runs a citizen science project, it's also incredible the amount of ground that can be covered by all those people and all those different eyes looking out. Linda wanted to know if we know anything about the effect of this flu on songbirds.
Well, yeah, what was Linda's question? I was looking at it a minute ago. What was her question?
What about the effect of the flu on songbirds?
Oh, gee, I don't know. And I don't have a clue, actually, to tell you the truth. Andrew, did you get any reports or maybe somebody else does? Did you get any reports?
Trying to remember, I guess one of the weirder ones I heard was like ruffed grouse, which I know isn't a songbird, but it's not a bird you would expect to be infected. But apparently in Newfoundland here, we had some infected ruffed grouse. But I haven't heard of much in songbirds, but I think possibly blue jays. I can't. There's a site where all these are reported, the OIE, and I can't remember all the details. I'm sorry.
No, that's
But
okay.
generally, songbirds have not been affected, to my knowledge, mostly. Yeah.
I was gonna say Jenna and I were out in the field for a considerable part of the summer, early summer, so before the sort of big explosion happened, but we didn't see anything either.
If they get infected, though, they will be like this. It sort of doesn't have any preferences unless they have immunity. They would be probably die. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you answered the question about thick-billed MERS, Bill. So Ian said, in Scotland, in response to concern about the spread of highly pathogenic avian flu, all capture and banding and other research activity requiring direct contacts with birds in seabird colonies was stopped as of June 10th, 2022 by authorities. Have we done anything similar here?
Nothing that I know of. Nothing that I know of. And I don't know the extent of that in the European colonies either, but you know, I've heard that that's ongoing, and that nothing that I know of. I don't know of any restrictions. There's been self-imposed restrictions. I know people that I work with have not, have absolutely not gone to other colonies for that reason, where other colonies that they would normally visit or could visit. So on that level, some biologists are doing that, but there's no regulation. We don't have any regulations that restrict access.
Okay. So Chris noted that some jays were reported on the mainland, and he's put a link in the chat for the site that Andrew was referencing, which is helpful. And Bruce added that corvids have reports. So we've got reports in corvids from scavenging, but generally low risk in songbirds, which is sort of the conclusion we'd come to. Karen wondered if there are any positives reported in the smaller hawks.
Oh, sorry. Any
Yeah,
positives?
maybe-
Not
maybe
that I
check
know
that
of,
site
but
with the
Andrew
soil.
might. Yeah.
No, not that I know, but that site would probably be the best site to check. I can't say.
Okay. And just going back to the sort of what we were saying about reporting depending on eyes, Ian asked if anybody actually visited the Gannet Islands in Labrador during July, August, September of this year.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, and that's a good question. I've contacted the CWS people in Labrador and have gotten information from her and maybe some other people, and even some indigenous people have sent in some reports and made some reports for sure. But even from CWS, those are the only reports I've got. So I don't think, but I don't know if anybody went to the gannets. The other way it can be done, well, I don't know if the gannets are a good colony like that. You can do the flyovers when you got a colony like Cape St. Mary's, where you got a colony like Funk, where you can see everything or see a lot of it. But I can't answer that question, but I'm sure Environment Canada knows and could.
Okay. And I'm just going to throw in a question of my own here, since we're coming to the end of the chat questions. And I'm just curious, Andrew, this may be a question for you, but has anybody been tracking, as we're all so familiar with the idea of viruses mutating thanks to COVID, I'm curious whether anybody's been tracking the spread through the birds and investigating whether we're seeing mutations and changes in the viruses, and if so, what they are.
Oh, that's a huge plan for us. So we have all these samples that have come over the time of this outbreak. And so we just need to do the work, basically. So I have students in my lab that are working on this, but this wasn't anyone's project when they came into my lab, but suddenly they're diverted and they're doing this on sort of on the side. So that's one of our main questions is tracking how it's changing over time. This virus mutates very quickly and changes very fast. So that's one of the things we're interested in. It's one of my main interests in this virus in general.
Yeah, I think that'll be some very cool research. Ian wanted to know whether the flu could overwinter in the Robin Hood Bay dump and reinfect seabirds next year. And he says, I think that
Great
question is
question.
also directed at you, Andrew.
Yeah, great question. Andrew, what do you
Well,
think?
I mean, the virus survives in the environment. Whether it would survive at the dump, I'm not sure, but in the population there,
Yeah,
hard
he
to
meant
say.
in gulls. Sorry,
Yeah.
he's just added that.
yeah, right, in gulls, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know that it can continuously circulate in that population. I feel like it's gonna go through and then kill those it will kill, and then the rest will survive. But the virus can survive in the environment, but that's really only been studied in like lakes where we know it can survive over a winter period. So
Gotcha.
it's hard to say what the role of the dump is in all of this, except it's a good place for gulls.
Yeah, that makes sense. One more quick question, this again from me, because I'm sort of cheating a little bit here, but we're out of questions in the chat. So I just wondered if we actually know what the mortality rate is with this virus. I can see that it'd be a very difficult question to answer, and you're both shaking your heads. So
Yeah, and it's the key question. I think that's the question that will fall to Canadian Wildlife Service, population estimates. And there will be a way, I think it's the first question, and it's really good to put some dimension on it, at least in terms of order of magnitude. We're talking tens of thousands of birds. And, there would be ways that CWS with that aerial photograph can at least tell you how many they see dead there. And that's going to be a lot of birds, but the question is, what do you don't see? So that's going to, and my feeling is there's birds out there, there's birds out there, and sometimes there's a lot of immature birds out there that are just itching to come in. So I really don't know. But I guess the best assessment of that will be, well, what's going to happen next spring when the birds start coming back to the colony, and I think that's when we'll know. And I think what's really interesting, we're talking about, say, the gannet. Well, we really want to talk about the population of the gannet, which is a North Atlantic population. So when we want to think about what the impact on gannets is, I think we have to tally up, well, what was the mortality in Scotland and Norway and Iceland and here, and then do those tallies, and those will be the numbers, I think, that might be really telling. I mean, regional numbers will be important, but it's going to be those pan-Atlantic. It's for the whole species range that will tell us. And the only other curious thing that I saw, and there's so many curious things, but it doesn't look like there were some places that didn't seem to get infected, and one of which, where we have really good coverage in Quebec, is Bonaventure. That's the largest colony in North America, and it's almost the largest colony in the world. And it didn't seem to have the devastation that we saw at Cape St. Mary's, and that we saw in the Magdalens, and that we saw in Funk Island. So 3 out of 6 took big hits that we know of. And Bonaventure Island had birds die, but it didn't look like it was devastation.
right. Jenna has a great question. Jenna, do you want to jump in and ask that, or did you want me to ask it?
I'm sure I'll jump in. I was just wondering if we know if chicks that are born to immune parents will also be immune, or if it's like a fresh start for the next generation.
Andrew Lang will answer.
So you can detect maternal transferred antibodies in the eggs of birds, and then presumably those persist at least sometime in the chick, but they will not be long lasting. And so it basically is coming in naive at some point where it won't have any long-term protection. It will have some short-term protection, but not long-term. And then I just had one comment about the question on mortality rates, because it's almost impossible to know, even if you do experimental studies, because they don't mimic the wild thing. The only birds we actually know the mortality rates for are chickens, because if it gets in a chicken farm, every single one is killed either by the virus or by people. So in chickens and poultry and domestic birds, the mortality rate is 100%. But everything else, it's not. It's very,
Right.
it's almost impossible.
There's actually there's actually some good information in the chat. I did see John Goss mention that he had 3 eagles, I think, in Eastport. I saw that comment go by. So that's the kind of information that's really valuable. Like, we will still put that information into the database that we have. So if people have any observations like that, it'd be great to see them.
Now I'll send you a copy of the chat, Bill, but
Oh, I
should
really appreciate that, for sure.
should they email those comments to you, or?
Well, it would be cool if you send me the whole thing. I mean, I know John, so I can go back to him. But what seemed really interesting about what he said, it sounds like they were all in the same place. I'd have to look and see if we had lots of MERS in that area dying as well. And it'd be interesting, but it'd be interesting to just get the information. So if we get the chat, that's great. We can contact people, if we have questions. But if anybody wants to email, happy to take them. I'm just Mont, MONT @mun.ca.
I'll put that in the chat as well. Oh, Jenna and I had exactly the same idea at the same time. Okay, and Hugh has a couple questions, and we'll wrap it up soon because you guys have stayed longer than I told you you'd have to, so we really appreciate it. But I thought this was going to be of great interest to everyone. So Hugh said, any species-specific variants? He's curious, and any sign of H5N8 in North America?
Oh, there you go, Andrew.
So there's nothing published that I'm aware of, but my understanding is there have been, by other groups, reassorted viruses found. I don't know about H5N8, but yeah, so I don't have any direct knowledge, but it's inevitable that that's the case.
Okay.
Mhm.
Hugh also said that, Bill, he made a couple of comments to you that may be of potential interest to the audience. And
Yeah,
he
where
wanted-
are they, Hugh? I'm looking back through. I saw you DM'd something, but what's your question?
Yeah, I don't have access to that, so I can't tell you that. But I can say that he mentioned which mammals the species or the flu had been identified in, and also some non-seabird species so lots of corvids and pine siskins.
Yeah, that's a weird one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can.
Okay, they're all in there, and somebody put a link to the federal database, and that'll show you everything that has been confirmed across Canada. And there's a whole bunch of mammals. They're probably just one-offs or small numbers, oddities. And there's a bunch of different hawks that have been identified, and random songbirds, and probably in fairly odd situations. That's it.
Excellent.
Hugh, what you're mentioning, these are birds that have been tested positive, is that correct?
Yeah, they're on the federal database, and they're not in this province.
Yeah, well, we're really interested in this east to west migration of accessing information from the Maritimes as well. And I've been trying to get that from Environment Canada, and I don't think they're, so far they are actually refusing to give it to us, which is a little bit gut wrenching. But yeah.
There's a lot.
Anyway, but that was something we could look at. Yeah, but that's just birds that tested positive.
Yes, I presume so.
Yeah.
I don't know if some of them are only H5 and haven't been confirmed as
Yeah.
H5N1. Not sure. There's a lot of detail there to go through.
Yeah. I saw Robert Blackmore's got a question.
Well, I think he's following up on Ian's question. So Ian's got a question that Robert Blackmore commented on, and then also we've got one more question from Carolyn, and then we're going to stop. But Ian said that he finds it very perplexing that the flu appears in Newfoundland in December, then in the middle of winter it infects chickens in Alberta in January, February. How is that possible given that there's minimal east to west migration in January? And Robert said, opposed to east to west migration, could the Alberta cases maybe come from a separate European Arctic breeding species, a gull or goose or something? Or do we know for sure that the Alberta strain came from Newfoundland?
Yeah,
So I
you know,
can
Andrew
answer
can
that,
speak
so.
to this, but there's been incursions, from the western part of North America too, right? So it's
Yeah.
not just here.
So there was actually an independent arrival on the Pacific coast from, I guess, the Russian side of a different strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza. So it actually came into North America from both sides this year. That was subsequent to figured out after the Newfoundland incidents in November, excuse me.
Okay,
So it's coming in both directions,
It
but
came both directions,
yeah, yeah.
lovely.
Yeah.
All right, last question is just, again, is there anything else that the public can do to help besides reporting? Is there anything? I think, Bill, on one of your slides, you mentioned burying trash at the dump or something to that effect. So is there anything else that can be done to help?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are those things about the dump. There are the things about what we see in the colonies. And I just know from my perspective and the perspective in my lab, we're just working on the one thing that we can get, and that's information. So, and I've seen a couple here on the chat. For example, the one from John Goss. So if we can glean more information, and I really, this bird's still coming in, and maybe those guys who are out hunting, I hope they're really skeptical, and we could be getting reports from them. As a matter of fact, CWS told me today that they would be testing birds that were shot in the hunt. So that's a good thing. I mean, given that Andrew said, well, if you cook it, it's not going to matter, but I still wouldn't eat it, I think. But given that they would test them, I mean, that might really make somebody think twice. That the bird that you got is infected, so you might want to think about if you want to, eat it or put it in your freezer. But so they are going to do that. That'll be a new piece of information.
What
that will
about
be
bird
valuable.
feeders?
Yeah.
Should
sorry?
people take bird feeders down?
Oh, well, I put mine up when the frost comes. It's just because I enjoy having them, and I essentially feed myself. I just feed birds on the ground. So they, and we hang a couple of things, but I don't, I don't do it so birds can concentrate at a feeder. And I know there's different takes on it, but it's a personal thing. So, but yeah, now I wouldn't put anything up. There's so much food out there now for songbirds. I mean, I wouldn't even think about it. It's only in the cold weather that, that the birds have, much less risk of infection from all sorts of things.
Right. And yeah, I believe also if it becomes strongly urged to take feeders down, I suspect that CWS will communicate that, or Environment Canada will share that information. I will at this point shut it down, I think, but lots of people in the chat also said thank you very much. So I would just like to echo that. Thank you very much, Andrew and Bill. That was really great. Super interesting. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for everybody for joining in, and thanks for all the questions. It makes it so much more helpful for all of us to think about it, because it's a two-way street. And yeah, that's great. Thanks. Oh, there's Vicky Friesen.
Oh, wow. Hi,
Oh
Vicky.
my goodness, Vicky. That's terrific. You never know who you're going to meet.
No, never know, especially
No,
with these
you never
virtual
know.
things.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much and take care. Have a good night, everyone. We'll be back again next week with another webinar.
Okay. All the best every
You
night.
too.
Good night. Thanks so
Good
much,
night.
Andrew. Hey, Vicky.
You bet.